So even with all the marking I have going on at the moment, I needed a break. And rather than writing a paper, I thought I'd try something different. I've been experimenting recently on History Saturdays with putting up a little bit of history about what I'm doing by video. And so I thought I would see if I could do some of my PowerPoints. So this is going to start over the next few days, a series of about 16-minute blasts of a presentation I did a couple of years ago at a BCMH conference. Each one's going to be roughly a minute, and they're basically going to be history minutes on the tribal class experience. Surprise, surprise. I don't spend my whole life talking about these destroyers. Do not bring them up at every opportunity I can get. It's a thing to see if it works and see if people like it. So, hope you do. Each one's going to be roughly a minute long, so stay tuned. More to come. Hello, so welcome to the first of this. I called this presentation the Tribal Class Experience, Lessons of the Last Treaty Destroyers, because in many ways the Tribal Class Destroyers were the last of the Royal Navy's treaty destroyers. Other classes were built after, and yes, they did fulfill treaty requirements, but these are the last destroyers which are built to the edge of the treaty prior to World War II, or rather prior to the point of which World War II was going to be around the corner and everyone saw it coming, so no one could avoid it. They were conceived as cruiser fill-ins. I get into trouble with this because I have a phrase I like to bring out sometimes at conferences called back pocket cruisers. The Tribal class destroyers were designed to do the jobs which there weren't enough light cruisers for. That was scouting, that was escorting, that was presence missions. And they did it well. With these operational requirements, these mission envisionments, came certain capability requirements, which is what is featured in design. Now, the interesting thing about the tribals is that so much of their design was cemented before they were even built, but so much of their concept of operations was still up for debate long after they had even come off the slipways. There are still debates going on about how best to use them to fulfill those cruiser roles. But the thing was, everyone was happy that the design had done this. They cost, on average, £513,000. So, they weren't cheap. But their design was designed to provide them with capability against all potential threats. They had enough firepower to be scary, but not so much they were going to cost the Earth. This is important. So their layout, which was the classic cruiser layout rather than the classic destroyer layout. Destroyers usually emphasized their torpedo armament. That was their primary offensive weapon, especially against other ships. But the tribals have less torpedoes and more guns. That's a primary anti-destroyer weapon, but it's also a primary weapon that you associate with the larger vessels. These ships were designed to go toe-to-toe, turret-to-turret, if not gun-to-gun, with cruisers. They were also given something else rather cool. They were given the Fuse-Keeping Clock Mark II. Now, I know I put on a very random posh voice for that, but it's important to remember the Fuse-Keeping Clock Mark II was the Aegis combat system of its day. It was supposed to provide ships with a much improved targeting capability, which meant more chance of success. So they carried 4 twin 4.7-inch quick-firing guns in, I think they were the Mark 12s, in A, B, and XY positions. It had anti-aircraft armament, which included 2-pounders and quadruple 4.5 inches. It had a quadruple 21-inch torpedo system, and it also carried depth charges. So it could be a threat to big ships with its torpedoes, because they were ship killer ones. It could be a threat to submarines, because it carried the depth charges. It could be a threat to all destroyers and all the smaller ships, because its guns were more than enough to overwhelm most threats that it would face. And it carried what was for the time, a significant AA fitting. I know by the time World War II rolls around, that is is over. That's a laughable AA fitting, but for the 1930s, that was a fairly good destroyer AA fitting. They get up to prior World War II, but after they've been launched. Well, most famously, they took part in the Spanish Civil War, where they were often doing quite critical duties of trying to keep peace and trying to stop the war spreading and causing trouble for international trade. Also occasionally acting as an ambulance service for ambassadors when they got into trouble. But they also did some more interesting stuff. HMS Asante, sometimes called Ashanti, sometimes called Asante, it depends how you pronounce it and who you're talking to. Honestly, I'm English and terribly bad at languages, I do admit this, so please correct me if I'm wrong. She goes to visit Takrady in modern-day Ghana, and she has a Durbar, and she is blessed by the Asante tribe and their leaders, and it's really quite a big occasion. It's a very big ceremony. Now, it's interesting, and my article about her contains far more details about this, but the reason HMS Ashanti's trip to Ghana is interesting, the reason why her blessings are interesting, is because she's one of the 4 out of 16 tribal class destroyers which survives World War II. And like Eskimo, she doesn't consider her bow a disposable weapon. She actually goes through the war, and she does pretty well. And part of that could well be down to the good luck bestowed on her by a silver bell and golden shield given to her by Chief Prembe II, I think. It was rather an interesting occasion if you consider this poor gentleman had only been allowed back by colonial authorities not that much before he turned up to bless the Royal Navy ship. It must be quite interesting diplomacy going on there of some kind. Some very good politics, probably. We get on to World War II. And my favourite battle which the tribals get involved in World War II is the Battle of Narvik, which you can't really see that well from there. So let me please move you in closer, and let's hope I can line this up properly. Now, Narvik is an interesting battle. For starters, whether you call it the second or the third is a highly, highly debated topic. I call it the second and the third. It's the second battle of Narvik as far as the Royal Navy concerns, hence the second. But it is actually technically the third. The first battle is technically not the one where the Royal Navy destroyers get wiped out, or the H-class, or mostly wiped out. It is the battle which the Norwegians fight to defend Narvik when the Germans first turn up. Now, this battle is interesting because pretty much it's a revenge fight. The tribal crews are annoyed. When I said revenge fight, what I mean is by the tribal crews being annoyed is they'd work with the H-class flotilla quite often. They knew them, they were their friend ships, and they had been taken out by an enemy who, frankly, in the tribals' opinions, they shouldn't have been fighting alone. They shouldn't, in the tribals' worldview, that when it came to fighting enemy destroyers, especially elite enemy destroyers, like some of the German heavy destroyers that had been at battle at Narvik, and were at Narvik when the tribals turned up, they were their opponents, they were their competitors, their contemporaries, and therefore they were for them. And they made sure they were for them. This whole fight, you have pretty much the Royal Navy Admiral on HMS Warspite trying to hold back the tribal crews, trying to stop them charging too far ahead, and he eventually just gives up and lets them go, because frankly it's easier than keep holding them back. One of them rams their way into a harbour. Who rams herself into a harbour is actually HMS Cossack. But this is a picture of HMS Eskimo, which during the battle decides to charge up a fjord where there are some remaining German destroyers. And even though the Germans fired their torpedoes and one actually hits and takes off her bow, the guys in Manning B turret kept on firing, even though their mates in A turret had all been gone. And X and Y turret continued engaging. She actually turns and begins advancing fires her own torpedoes, and then begins advancing stern first towards the Germans, continuing to drum draw as more Royal Navy destroyers pile round the corner after her. As I said, they took this battle personally. They took what the Germans had done to H-class personally. And it isn't the only battle which they do take personally, and it's perhaps an ethos that the crews had, but the ships and the crews were sort of one, in that they had a lot of fighting spirit in the tribals. So the chase of the Bismarck. Well, the tribals weren't supposed to be as involved in it as they were. Again, they had traditionally escorted quite a few of the battle cruisers, Hood, Repulse, and a few others, because they were fast destroyers and could keep up. They were off doing other duties when what happened to Hood. And one of the things they were off doing was actually 4th Destroyer Flotilla under a guy called Captain Vian, Philip Vian, a very interesting guy, was actually down escorting a convoy off the coast of Africa. He leaves the convoy when he hears the Bismarck has broken out and it's coming in, it's now trying to get home, it's in its own area. He leaves the convoy in the care of the C-class AA cruiser. As just said, Philip Vian left the convoy. I think it was, I've got it written down somewhere on this one. Not sure. He left the convoy in the care of their C-class AA cruiser, which was really not that great, but it was enough to look after them in his mind, and charges across the Atlantic. Literally charges across the Atlantic without orders to do so. He's using every latitude of command he's able to be given, and it's a good job he does, because if the 4th DF and its tribals destroyers hadn't got there when it did, then Bismarck might have managed to disappear during the night, because the cruisers shadowing them were having to back off. They were running out of fuel, they were running low. So the 4th DF turns up like this avenging army and get told to follow it. Now, there is almost a very interesting end to the Bismarck story, in that, well, the tribal destroyers of 4th Destroyer Flotilla didn't exactly just follow her. They spent the evening firing torpedoes at her the whole night, diving in, launching an attack, pulling back out, just harassing her constantly. So Bismarck's crew didn't get a wink of sleep, because they had these nutty destroyers, which were about a 30th of their size, charging at them, trying to go, we're going to beat you. And the thing is, with the 21-inch torpedoes, they did actually have that chance. They actually had the ORP Pirin, an attached Polish destroyer, with them as well, although that vessel didn't get involved in night fighting because it hadn't been with the Royal Navy long enough to actually know what attacks were doing, so they thought it best to, their command for the best to keep back. Well, we all know how Bismarck's story ends, so I've skipped on to the Battle of Cape Bon. Now, the Battle of Cape Bon is an interesting battle in that you have these ships which have been designed to act as cruisers take on Italian cruisers and destroy them. It was not particularly nice. It was not particularly kind. They had an idea where the Italian destroyers were, and they used it shamelessly. They managed to gut round, so they were between the shore and the Italian cruisers, and they attacked them, and in very quick order, before actually the 2 tribals charge in, and the 2 other destroyers with them, which I think was the HMS Legion and Isaac Squares, which was HNMS Isaac Squares, didn't even really get to fire. They got taken out by HMS Seacon Maori. The interesting thing about the Battle of Cape Bon is the way the Royal Navy uses the 4.7-inch gunfire. One of the things that have been theorized about the tribals could do prior to World War II was they could use their gunfire to sort of fix targets and highlight targets instead of using star shell, but to highlight them by firepower. And that would enable other ships, other more conventional destroyers, to launch their torpedoes more accurately. In this case, it was the Royal Navy tribals providing both the fire and the torpedoes. There is a debate as to whether Legion's torpedoes did actually manage to get into the fight, and possibly they did help the second cruiser. We know the first cruiser was wiped out by Seek as completely solo. The second cruiser then had a nasty fight with Seek, Maori, and Legion. Isaac swears was just too far away. Despite being too far away that day, Isaac Swears was actually a very, very good destroyer and gets into lots of fights. Just want to add that in. Now, moving on next, we have the Battle of Shunt. Now, this is a very interesting battle because, A, they are back in an almost 8-ship flotilla. Prior to this point, the Royal Navy had pretty much divided all destroyers up into 4-ship units. But suddenly, we have a flotilla formed, the 10th flotilla, which has Tartar, Ashanti, Eskimo, Canadian tribals Haida and Huron, HMS Javelin of the J-class, and 2 Polish destroyers, the ORP Purin and the OPR Blaswanka. I'm really, really bad at names, so I will zoom in close. Right, so they engaged the German 8th flotilla. And they did a very, very good job of it. In fact, pretty much wiping out that unit before, so it couldn't get involved in anything to do in the reinforcement of D-Day, because it was on the 9th of June, 1944. It was also the tribal's last major employment in European theatre before they would get deployed elsewhere. Now, after Ushant, after D-Day, the war in Europe was kind of dying down. What was needed there were anti-submarine warfare vessels and commando convoy escorts, that sort of thing. The Royal Navy had other uses for its fighting destroyers. And this was offensive cruising, basically. They were going to go out to the Far East and they were going to get the Royal Navy Sea Control. A good example of that is Operation Irregular. Its very name suggests how irregular it was. They were sent out to pretty much do what the German 8th Flotilla had been trying to do on D-Day, which was clear the road. They were clearing the road of any Japanese infestation on the way to Singapore. And on the 12th of June 1945, a little over a year after the Battle of Ushant, near the island of Rodo, which is just north of Sabang, I think, they detected 2 small echoes, which were a landing ship tank and a sub-chaser, basically a very small destroyer, possibly frigate-sized. Anyway, these do not end well for them. The Japanese do not have a good time in this battle, and the tribals carry on their clearing out. Now, the reason the tribals had been chosen for this was because they were considered uniquely capable of independent action. It was not just their weaponry fit or their fact that they had radar now, or all the other stuff they'd been retrofitted as war had gone on because their design had been so easy to upgrade. It was also the crews. As one admiral put it, the esprit de corps of the tribal destroyers knows no equivalent. These ships' crews felt that they were an elite of an elite. It didn't matter that there were newer destroyers which were bigger, faster, tougher, that had come off a production line or been designed as a result of World War II. The tribal crews had realised that their colleagues and they had fought in hard battles. It didn't matter if you were new to the crew or had been in there serving the whole way through the war. You knew you were a tribal crew. You knew you were special. And this meant that for independent action, they could be relied on to have their morale high no matter what the threat, no matter what the cost. They would be going out there and they would do the job. Brings us to the conclusion. Well, tribal class destroyers weren't cruisers. As much as they were used as cruisers, they weren't. They do act like it. They're used as it. They are the back pocket cruisers, the RN. But they are destroyers. And destroyers have a different mentality. Destroyers are more aggressive. They have to be. They are the small ships which can be sent in against very, very heavy fire in this time to take out the enemy. They had to be a fighting elite. And it's rather interesting that these days we consider cruiser a very aggressive imperial term. And so we don't call our ships, despite their size, cruisers. But destroyer is acceptable. Whereas in the 1920s and 30s, destroyers were always seen as the far more aggressive, far more warlike vessels. Cruisers were the diplomats. They were the sword and the shield. The destroyers were the swords. They were shameless about it. In medieval army terms, if you want to do that, they were longbowmen. The cruisers were knights on horseback, riding around, looking very impressive, very, well-mannered. They were absolutely lethal, don't get me wrong. They were fighting like no other, but they were also courtly and gentlemanly and able to put on a good party. The tribals were destroyers. They were a killing elite. That is what destroyers were there for. They were there to destroy the enemy. Originally just torpedo boats, but they expanded to pretty much anything across their path. Tribals were destroyers which were given enough space and enough size they could easily be expanded, but they could also do some cruiser duties. So, again, using the medieval army approach, perhaps they were they were king's archers. I.e., they were still professional killers, but they were expected to look good in uniform and to be able to stand around at a ceremonial function and not make the place look like it was going to the dogs. And they did that.